It is always a benefit to remind ourselves of things, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned to the Prophet, وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, right? Remind, for the reminder benefits the believers. So inshallah, we have to remember that, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed us with a masjid, right? A house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which means that this is the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So which means that being in a masjid, or being in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, requires its etiquettes. We should never treat it like our own houses, right? It's not our house. We don't do in it whatever we please, but there's specific etiquettes. Now also it depends on which masjid you are. For example, the etiquettes in masjid, in the masjid of Prophet ﷺ is completely different than the masjid that we're in, right? Considering especially that the Prophet ﷺ's grave is in that masjid. Even Umar ibn al-Khattab, he would require or ask or demand a different higher respect of the people when they attend that masjid. So what that means is that we have to be very careful what we conduct in here, right? In our attitude, in our way we speak, in the way we behave, but also it includes in the what we take to the masjid, what we wear to the masjid, right? One of the most important things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, He said, وَخُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ masjid. Take the zina, right, your best outfits to the masjid. Now I'm not saying we always have to be decked out in suits and all these things, but we should be careful, try our, of course not mandatory by the way, to take your best attire, but this is an advice, this is what is best, because it indicates that you're respecting, you're respecting this masjid that you're dealing with it in a different way. You're giving it its importance. Now also, which means that we should also make sure that we abide by the Islamic attire, right? MashaAllah, it starts when we're young. I see sometimes, boys that are close to teenage years running around with really short shorts. That's not how it should be, right? MashaAllah, I see sisters that walk into the masjid without a hijab. That is not appropriate, right? Not appropriate in a masjid of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because what it means is that we are actually intentionally disobeying Allah in His house. Of course, in the masjid outside should not matter, right? But specifically, right, when it comes to the masjid, we have to be very careful about this, right? So parents, I would like to ask if you have your children, train them that way, right? If you're bringing the boys to the masjid, make sure, I'm saying this because I know it's the summer, right? Make sure that that their shorts are in the proper length, that the girls starting at the age of 7 and 8 or 9, that you're training them to wear the hijab, properly. If you're older and you're an adult, then this is a bit more of something that is important, because the reality is if you're walking around without a hijab, that's a major sin, let alone in the masjid, right? So it's just an advice, inshallah, for everybody to also in their behavior. We should never be fighting in the masjid, never insulting the masjid, all these things, right? طيب, where's Tawsif? Can we start or not yet? Can we start the halaqah or not yet? We're good? Jazakumullah khair. طيب. Oh, has it been live? You should have told me, ya Shaykh. He told me to stop and then you got to cut this part out. طيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. So today, inshallah, we're starting a new series. And hopefully, inshallah, you find it interesting. And it's a series of looking into the stories of the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran many different stories about different different tribes and different groups and different communities, but also different prophets. And those are mentioned in there in the Quran, obviously for a benefit, right? There's a huge benefit to having these stories in the Quran, right? The least of it is to look and reflect how the prophets dealt with their people, for example, right? What they called for, the methodologies that they used to call people to Islam, the hardships that they faced, but also the mistakes that their community have fallen into so that we ourselves would avoid it, right? That is something that is of importance. And there are several prophets that are mentioned in the Quran. And inshallah, we're going to take as much of them as we can. How long, whatever the series, picking a topic like this can last for years, I'll be honest with you. Because if you take every prophet and look into it, it can take some time. So we'll take it one session at a time. So we're going to start today with Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now that being said, does anybody know what is which prophet was which prophet was mentioned most in the Quran? Musa alayhi salam, right? Musa alayhi salam is the prophet that was mentioned most, and his people, right? Which means when we start, when we start Musa alayhi salam's story, inshallah, expect that we're going to spend several months. It's a long story, right, from beginning to the end. طيب, the second prophet was mentioned most. Who was it? Huh? Sorry, I'm hearing a sound from there, but I can't hear what it is. Sorry, what do you say? Somebody from the sister side said something, and I think it's correct. I just couldn't hear. Ibrahim, that is correct, right? The second prophet that's mentioned most in the Quran is Ibrahim alayhi salam, all right? So today, inshallah, when we look at Surah Ibrahim, I would like to start first with looking at the entire story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, but more of start with a framework, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam in about 96 places. 96 places in the Quran he was mentioned. So we're trying to gather some of them obviously in bigger, in longer verses of the Quran, like in bigger, I guess, chunks of the story mentioned in certain surahs, and then others kind of just slightly mentioned in a couple of verses and so on. So we're going to gather most of those, try to start a story with it. But generally speaking, when we look at the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? I want to start with kind of building a framework, right, to understand the where Ibrahim alayhi salam story begins, right, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described certain backgrounds and the culture that he came from. So we're going to talk about the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? All right. So here's what I'm planning for this session, right? Give that background and at least start the first part of diving into the seerah of Ibrahim alayhi salam, which has to do with his da'wah to his father, right? I don't know how much time I'm going to do this in, but that's my aim and goal. Quite often, unfortunately, I can never finish the content that I kind of prepared for. But inshallah, hopefully we'll ask Allah to give a barakah in this. But if we don't finish now, we'll finish the next time. But we're going to take a look at the as a frame or a background, we're going to look at the culture or the group of people that Ibrahim alayhi salam was sent to. We're going to talk about the Ibrahim alayhi salam, his personality himself, right, as an individual, how he was described and so forth. So when we talk about the people or the culture or the environment that Ibrahim alayhi salam was sent to, we're going to talk about, for example, their belief system, right? We're going to talk about their social system and also their political system or environment that they lived in. And the reality is, those three are quite often connected, right? And it always starts with the belief system, right? It doesn't matter what kind of belief system it is, because out of the belief system, the cultural aspects, right, the norm and the societal aspects will sprout from that belief, but also the political things will also sprout from that belief system, right? This is why we have to understand that this whole thing about separate your belief from the, from the work and politics, that's not true. What drives everything is what we believe, regardless of what it is, right? If it's a religious system that you use as a belief or a secular system, it's still a form of belief. Or is it atheism? It's still a form of belief, right? And so to request people to separate between those is not realistic, right? So that's why I'm bringing this in to look at this. So when we talk about the religious aspect of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and this is more of the, their belief system, the Qawm Ibrahim, they were individuals that were, when he was sent to them, they were idol worshippers. They were polytheists. And they would believe that these idols that they worship were actually capable of providing them with provision. Okay? And I'm saying this because I'm it's a prelude or introduction. So when you look at how Ibrahim gave da'wah to his father, I want you to have this in the, in the background of your mind, because it comes from that, right? Because he's providing proofs to his father about why what he's doing is wrong. And it has to do with their false belief system, and he brings that into play, right? So the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam believed that these idols were actually capable of providing for them, okay? And it got so bad that almost, it was meant, the scholars of tafsir would mention that almost every individual had their own personal idol, right? It wasn't just like a big idols that everyone would worship or one or two, but each one of them was capable of attaining or acquiring their own personal idol that would worship, right? And if they do that, these idols would provide them with food, with support and drink and everything. So this is from from this aspect. And because they believed, obviously, that they provide for them, it meant that they would do things for them, right? Rituals, acts of worship, because you tend to submit and worship whoever you believe benefits you. Does it make sense? Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Believing in lordship is associated with worship. They're tied together. If you believe an entity provides for you, you will worship and provide acts of worship to that entity. They're connected. Okay? طيب. Now the other thing that they believed in is that they did not believe in resurrection. These people did not believe in resurrection or the Day of Judgment. Now if you understand that, it's not a surprise that this kind of belief gets repeated again. Because subhanAllah, that exact same model was what the people of Quraysh had. They also worshipped the idols. Thank you, good. And did they believe in the hereafter and resurrection? No, they didn't, right? SubhanAllah, the same thing got repeated. And one thing we can learn is that misconceptions tend to be repeated over time. Okay, they tend to be repeated over time, and sometimes it can be even worse. And so this is one of the benefits of looking into those stories, is how to deal with these misconceptions, how to address them, but also can give us allow us to take preemptive measures with our own children, right? To kind of immunize them against these misconceptions, right? So when we see these mistakes happening throughout history, it gives us a chance to, to capitalize on that and to make sure that our future generation never fall into the same misconceptions, right? Like, now, this is the belief system. Now, when it comes to the cultural behavior, right? Once again, it's very intertwined with their belief system. Now, culturally, societally, when they did anything, it really was associated with their idols, right, and their worships, including their celebrations. This is why when you look at the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, the portion where they went out to celebrate their idols, right? Remember, the center of their focus is their idols. And so they do things, events that surround their idols. And so they would have these celebrations, right? They consider them as religious celebrations that are associated with their idols. And that's why Ibrahim alayhi salam refused to go out with them at that time when he left with them, right? So, that is more of a, the cultural scene that was mentioned in the Quran, right? Nothing other more than that. But for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to highlight this, it gives you the significance and understanding that people's societal and cultural behavior is tightly regulated to what they believe, right? Whether they believe something is right, they'll act upon it. They believe something is wrong, they'll tell you don't do it. Whatever it is, right? It is tightly associated with that. Now, when it comes to the political aspect, right? It was also around that, right? Once again, we said you cannot separate any of those things. So when it came to the political things, their rule, right, was affected by their idol worship, which means that if you tried to call it anything else, right, the politics in itself got involved with trying to stop that, which is not something that is strange, by the way. Any group of people that believe that whatever is right, they'll protect it. Okay? If you tell them that whatever you're believing or call something against it, they will not agree to it, right? They will try to stop it. Okay? And this is something that is fundamental. And will explain why people's reactions sometimes are severe towards, and sometimes illogically severe towards other things, even though of what that thing is, it might be correct. Okay? And sometimes it just makes no sense. Like, for example, I think recently in Uzbekistan, the government passed a rule that bans hijab, even though Uzbekistan is primarily a Muslim population, right? Muslim population. Now, why would they ban hijab? That makes no sense. It just absolutely makes no sense. As a government, you're supposed to tailor to your people, right? But obviously, this is something that is coming from outside, something uh, that is contaminating the fitrah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, corrupting it, right? And so severe reactions like that makes no sense, but it also explains the severe reaction of people like the people of Quraysh towards the Prophet ﷺ, even though what he said was logical, right? But the whole idea is that it's normal for people to try to protect their belief system, which also would explain why in Islam, now the difference is Islam is the truth, these are all falsehoods, right? Which gives us more right as Muslims to try to protect our faith from anything that would corrupt it. This is why, for example, in Muslim countries or Muslim nations, we don't allow the spread of disbelief, right? Freedom of speech, there's no such thing as called absolute freedom of speech. Not even in Western countries, does not exist, right? Because the freedom of speech is limited until you start harming, in Islam's perspective, spreading falsehood and atheism and wrong faith and misconception is harmful, right? Is harmful for people iman. It will take, if they slip and fall, they'll end up in the hellfire, right? We want to protect people, right? But anyway, the political system was, focused on that, including sometimes the ruler himself, to the point that he would claim deity, for example, because they come from that background. This was in Namrud, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala captured the discussion that Ibrahim alayhi salam, for example, had with the Namrud, right? وإذ قال إبراهيم وإذ قال إبراهيم يا رب الذي يحيي ويميت, right? Ibrahim was talking to Namrud. He said, my Lord gives life and death. And so this Namrud, the king, he said, أنا أحيي وأميت. I also give life and death. And of course, he played a bit of a gimmick to try to prove this. So he brought two prisoners. And then he said, you're free to go, and you're executed. And so he said, I gave him life, and I gave him death. Right? And then Ibrahim alayhi salam didn't bother arguing with him. He said, no, that's not real life, not death. He just ignored it. He said, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْتِي بِالشَّمْسِ مِنَ الْمَشْرِقِ فَأْتِ بِهَا مِنَ الْمَغْرِبِ. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings the sun out from the east. So bring it out from the west. So he moved to something that obviously no one can do but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no way around it. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَبُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرْ. Right? He was essentially buhita, which means he was exposed, that he's a lie. He was completely annihilated in the argument, the one who has disbelieved. But this was the nature of the people there. And this was the people of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Right? Now, when it comes to the personality or the Ibrahim alayhi salam as a person, right, alayhi salatu salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described him in several ways, gave him several qualities. Right? I'm going to mention those qualities I mentioned in the Quran. So one of the first ones is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described him as a ummah, right, as a nation. Right? Inna Ibrahim kana ummah, that Ibrahim was a nation. Now what does that mean? How is Ibrahim alayhi salam a nation? He had multiple personalities, what was it? Yes. Sorry? That's a good interpretation, right? That is actually maybe possibly one of the interpretations. That from the lineage of Ibrahim alayhi salam, right, came the lineage of prophets, right? Almost all the prophets afterwards came from the lineage of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and so this is why he was considered a nation afterwards. Some of the scholars say that ma'na ummah, the meaning of a nation, is that Ibrahim alayhi salam encompassed, right, the attributes of a nation, right? Which means that he had the completion of the qualities of individuals, right? This is why he is considered from ulul azm, right, the people of resolve. So ulul azm from the prophets, the elite prophets, ulul azm, the people of resolve, or the prophets of resolves are 5, right? And they are, who's the first one? This is not in order of, this is in order of that they were sent. Nuh, Ibrahim, Musa, Isa, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay? So once again, this is just in the order of when they were sent. And this was mentioned in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned this. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he described him also, in the Quran regarding an ummah, right? So he's like considered when we're talking about qualities. So he reached the epitome and peak of intellect, of knowledge, of strength, of resolve, right? Of spirituality and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All these attributes made him an example for everybody else. Like he's a nation to be followed. But the other interpretation is that like all of his lineage afterwards, or the lineage of prophets, came from Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now the other thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described the Ibrahim alayhi salam with, other than he described him as being imam, right? A leader, imam, a role model. When we look at this, right, even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, وَاتَّبِعْ مِلَّةَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ حَنِيفًا, right? Follow the millah, which means the belief system, right? Or the way of Ibrahim, Hanifa. Hanif, which means a person who is who moves away from disbelief to belief, right? Who moves away from disbelief to belief. And also, he's if you're talking about the lineage of Ibrahim alayhi salam, they were also made imma, right? Leaders to be followed, because essentially that they were prophets, right? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam was an imam. His lineage were also from the prophets, and they were leaders and role models. The third thing, which I kind of mentioned in passing, we're talking about ulul azm, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him from ulul azm. Right? I'm just talking about the personality of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So he was, the first thing we talked about was that he was a what? Ummah in himself. The second, he was an imam. The third is that he is from ulu al-azm. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِذْ أَخَذْنَا مِنَ النَّبِيِّينَ مِيثَاقَهُمْ وَمِنْكَ وَمِنْ نُوحٍ وَإِبْرَاهِيمَ وَمُوسَى وَعِيسَى ibn Maryam. All five were mentioned. Right? Minka is referring to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَنُوحَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَعِيسَى وَمُوسَى وَعِيسَى ibn Maryam. وَأَخَذْنَا مِنْهُمْ مِيثَاقًا غَلِيظًا. Right? And we took from them a very غليظ, which means like a very strong or a very big covenant. Right? Like, so this is he was described as from ulul azm. Right? Now, the other description Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described Ibrahim alayhi salam was he described him as a khalil. وَاتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ إِبْرَاهِيمَ Khalila, right? What does Khalil mean? What is al-khulla? Khulla? I know it gets translated as friend, but let's start slowly. Khulla. What is khulla? Sorry? I kind of find it interesting that the sisters answer more than the brothers. Closeness? No. Well, it does have an aspect of closeness, that is true. As a byproduct. What do you say, what? Privacy. What does that mean? It has to do with the heart, but not soft-hearted. It has to do with the heart. Not close type. Khulla is the highest level of love. It comes from تخلل. تخلل, which means it, تخلل شيء, which means it infiltrated, right? So it infiltrates the heart until it occupies all of it, right? That is the khulla. That's what it means. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, his heart was infiltrated and mixed and completely encompassed by the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also loved and chose Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now, the only other prophet that was given that quality was who? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And so when we think about Ibrahim alayhi salam, he is an individual that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala singled out and chose to be his Khalil. But it also means that Ibrahim alayhi salam, his love to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was so much that it infiltrated every aspect of his being, right? Every aspect of his being, including to the point that this was proven that he was willing to sacrifice the most valuable thing and most loved thing to him, which was his son. Right? Not just that, this was a son that came after he was of old age, right? And had no children and lost hope. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him Ismail. Ishaq was later on. Ismail, right? That was like, can you imagine? I imagine this. Like, this is an individual who longed to have children. And after becoming old of age, Allah blessed him with a single male child. Now that child grew to the point that that he would be able to go out with him and walk with him. And so he spent years with him. And that love gets nurtured and it grows and it becomes deeper, right? A father would sacrifice his life for, his son in that stage. But yet, he was willing to sacrifice his son for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? This tells you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Ibrahim alayhi salam, his love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was unparalleled by anything else. Right? طيب. And so being a Khalil, right, is one of the descriptions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given to Ibrahim alayhi salam. So this is just the background to give you of the cultural aspect that Ibrahim was sent to. Now, where Ibrahim alayhi salam was born was not discussed in the Quran. All right. In fact, was any of the childhood of the Prophet Ibrahim discussed in the Quran? No, right? It only spoke about Ibrahim alayhi salam after him being sent as a messenger, right? Prior to that, we never hear of anything about Ibrahim alayhi salam, his different stages of life. Ibrahim alayhi salam, this is not from the Quran itself, but it's from the Sunnah or from historical. He was born in Iraq, right? In Babel. He was born in Iraq, in Babel. Now, when the Quran, if you look at the Quran, when it discusses the different stories of the different prophets, sometimes the Quran does talk about the prophets during their childhood, right? An example of that is who? Musa and Isa, right? And then in other times, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talk about their story when they're in their youth, okay? When they're young in their youth, such as who? Yusuf and? No, that was not mentioned in the Quran. Dawood and Sulaiman. Right, Dawood and Sulaiman alayhi salam. Now the other one, the third one, is the majority. The large majority of the stories of the Prophet is spoke about them at the stage when they were prophets, after they were sent as the prophets, right? And how they dealt with their people. And this is that stage is what most is emphasized in the Quran, and the majority of stories we're going to be talking about, the prophets, is during that stage, right? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam is of that category that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about Ibrahim alayhi salam when he was a prophet. Now the second thing is that when we talk about the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran his story in two different stages. Right, two different stages. The first stage was, or phase in the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam, was when he was with his people in, where? Iraq. Good, excellent, when he was in Iraq. Now the second stage is after he left his people, right? And he was in Palestine. But in that stage, he had another prophet with him that accompanied him, and it was Lut alayhi salam. Okay? Even though, later on in Palestine, that Musa alayhi salam stayed in one place and Lut alayhi salam stayed in another place, also in Palestine, right? But it's a bit further. Still, they coincided as prophets, okay? And we know this throughout history. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends multiple prophets at the same time. And this is because each prophet is generally sent to his people, right? Each prophet is sent to his own people. And so sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send two prophets at the same time, right? And so in this case, we have Ibrahim alayhi salam and we have Lut alayhi salam. Another example of that is Isa and Yahya, right? And they were cousins, okay? An example of that is Isa and Yahya alayhi salam. And so it's not something that is strange. It was only the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He is the only prophet that was sent to all of nations. So the Prophet was not specifically sent to the people of Quraysh or the Arabian Peninsula. No, the Prophet ﷺ is the final and last messenger, and so he was given that unique attribute and quality that he was sent to all of the people, ins and jinn, right? To the humans and for the jinn. Allah alam. And so the second stage is like, when he went to Palestine. And so we will start with that first stage when Ibrahim alayhi salam was in Iraq. Okay. And what we're going to talk about today is the conversation that Ibrahim alayhi salam had with his father. And generally speaking, when you'd want to advise somebody with something of importance, you'll find that it's good to start with your closest people to you. Right? This is what the Prophet ﷺ, did himself when he started doing da'wah of Islam. The first people he called were his own households, right? Khadija radiallahu anha, and his children, his daughters, but also the people that were in his household that included not his relatives, such as his servants, right? They also accepted Islam. And his cousin Ali radiallahu anhu, because the Prophet ﷺ was raising him in his house, right? So that's why Ali radiallahu anhu was one of the people that accepted Islam at a younger age, because he was in the house of the Prophet ﷺ. But this is who he started with. Now from then on, the Prophet ﷺ went out and beyond from there, and he even started calling his closer of kin, the tribe of Quraysh, and then he would move outwards beyond that, okay? And so Ibrahim alayhi salam first started with his father. And today we're going to focus on that dialogue, right? That dialogue that happened between Ibrahim alayhi salam and his father, because it is a very beautiful dialogue. We're going to analyze the different, what the different aspects of it. How Ibrahim alayhi salam spoke to his father, but in return, how his father responded to him. And as we were going through this, yes, I understand that we're talking about Ibrahim alayhi salam and his father. His father's name was Azar, okay? We're not just talking about Ibrahim and Azar, but in reality, those two individuals embody the personalities of the believer and the disbeliever. Okay? And we're going to look at that behavior throughout history. We're going to highlight how that truly appears. Okay? And so when we look at this, essentially when we are doing da'wah, we should perhaps embody the behavior of Ibrahim alayhi salam, but also be aware of how the non-Muslims would react sometimes through the actions of Azar. And we should not be surprised, right? Even from a father, right? Even though that they are related, a father and a son, the severe reaction of Azar towards his son, we can understand what happened, and we should not be surprised by sometimes the severe reaction of the disbelievers toward the believers. So the argument, or not the argument, the discussion, the da'wah, the dialogue that happened between Ibrahim alayhi salam and his father, this is captured in Surah Maryam, right? In Surah Maryam, where Ibrahim alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ إِنَّهُ كَانَ صِدِّيقًا نَبِيًّا إِذْ قَالَ لِأَبِيهِ يَا أَبَتِ لِمَ تَعْبُدُ الشَّيْطَانَ لِمَ لَا تَعْبُدُ مَا لَا يَسْمَعُ وَلَا يُبْصِرُ وَلَا يُغْنِي عَنْكَ شَيْئًا يا أبت إني قد جاءني من العلم ما لم يأتك فاتبعني أهدك صراطا سويا يا أبت يا أبت لا تعبد الشيطان إن الشيطان كان للرحمن عصيا يا أبت إني أخاف أن يمسك عذاب من الرحمن فتكون للشيطان وليا. This is what Ibrahim alayhi salam spoke with, or the dialogue that he started with his father, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ, right? And mention in the book, right, Ibrahim alayhi salam. إِنَّهُ كَانَ صِدِّيقًا نَبِيًّا. In fact, he was a man of truth and a prophet. إِذْ قَالَ لِأَبِيهِ, right? When he told his father, يَا أَبَتِ, right? O father, لِمَ تَعْبُدُ مَا لَا يَسْمَعُ وَلَا يُبْصِرُ وَلَا يُغْنِي عَنْكَ شَيْئًا. Why do you worship, right? Why do you worship which does not hear, right, or see, or benefit you at all? You remember our conversation? Their belief system, right? And I want you to think of how Ibrahim did the da'wah to his father. They believed that these idols, what do they do? That they provide for them, okay? And now here Ibrahim is starting to try to ask the questions that would make them reflect to see, is this truly the case or not? We're gonna come back to this later on. And then Ibrahim alayhi salam, he said, Ya abati, inni qad ja'ani min al-ilmi ma lam ya'tika fattabi'ni ahdika siratan sawiyya. Oh my father, there has come to me some knowledge, right? Come to me of knowledge of what you don't have, right? Follow me, that you don't have. So follow me. I will guide you to a even path, sawiyya, like an even path. Ya abati, O father, inni akhafu an yamassaka. Ya abati la ta'bud ash-shaytana inna ash-shaytana kana lir-rahmani 'asiyya. O my father, do not worship the shaitan, for indeed the shaitan has ever been to the most merciful disobedient. كان للرحمن عصيا. يا أبتي إني أخاف يمسك عذاب من الرحمن فتكون للشيطان وليا. O my father, I fear that you be touched by a punishment from Ar-Rahman, from the most merciful, and so you would be to the shaitan a companion, waliya, companion, where in the hellfire, right? So this was the conversation, the dialogue that Ibrahim alayhi salam had with his father, right? Now let's take this verse by verse and look at some of the lessons we can deduce from it. So if we look at that first verse, right? Ibrahim alayhi salam, actually in fact all four of them, how do they all four start? Ya abati, right? Ya abati. Now, in these all four verses, when Ibrahim alayhi salam starts ya abati, ya abati, ya abati, ya abati, what is that? There's actually, we can deduce four benefits from this, right? What is, what does this implicate? Sorry, say it again. Dear dad, and here? Sorry? Respect for the father, right? So the word ya abati, is it like, an endearing form or not? Okay? It's an endearing form, right? It shows affection. It shows love, right? It's a reminder that I am your son and you are my father, right? And so when Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he started that conversation, essentially, the first thing we can look at is how he tried to stir into the heart of his father this fatherhood emotion, right? He started by trying to touch the emotion and the heart of his father by reminding him, like he's trying to stir that mercy, right? That shafaqa, that whole aspect of emotional connection that a person can have, and telling him, I'm not advising a regular person. I'm advising my father, and I'm your son, right? You're my father and I am your son, okay? And so he wants to reminding him that with this methodology, so that he would be more inclined to accept that advice, right? Now this tells us that one of the best things to do when we're advising an individual is try to figure out what is the best way, right, that would increase the chances of that individual of accepting an advice. And over here, Ibrahim alayhi salam was trying to get closer to his father by stirring that fatherhood emotion, right? That sense of fatherhood. Now the second thing is Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he was talking to him, right? Ya abati, right? لما تعبد الشيطان? He asked him a question. So لما تعبد ما لا يسمع ولا يبصر ولا يغني عنك شيئا? Why do you worship what doesn't hear, what doesn't see, or doesn't, cannot benefit you at all? Did he start by ordering him? He said do and don't? Is that how he started? No, but why? I want you to think of the dynamics. Father, son. But not just that. Usually, right, when it comes to equals even, right, people who are equal in status, or when you're talking about a person who's higher in status than another individual. So if you're talking to an equal or a person who's considered higher status, whether because they're older or their parents or whatever the case is, would they react favorably to orders? Right? Most likely not. Right? Most likely not. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam didn't do that because he did not want, because usually orders, when it comes to that manner, a person tends to have this, almost like an immediate resistance, to it. But also this is from the adab al-nubuwah, right? The perfect manners of prophethood. That like even though Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was a prophet, which automatically puts him in a higher status than his father. Automatically. But yet Ibrahim alayhi salam, from the perfect manners that he had, he posed it in a question form. Right? He posed it in a question form. Why do you worship? Right? Why do you worship? Right? Once again, this is like, amazing manners, like, something that we should learn from this story. Now the third benefit we can learn from this is that Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he was having that conversation with his father, he went to the core of the issue. He didn't take any sort of tangent arguments, whatever the case is, right? He went to the core of the aspect, the most important aspect of faith and religion, which is worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that right? Yes? And that's really important. Now, did he talk to him about, prayers and fasting? No, not yet, right? One thing that is consistent from the first messenger, from the first prophet to our last prophet ﷺ, is that they were all united on a single da'wah, which is the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can see other things that can vary, right? Such as what is halal or haram, that can vary. How to pray, salah, right? That can vary. How to fast, that can vary. But all of them had that one consistent message, and which teaches us that when we have discussions with the non-Muslims, we need to go to the core, right? We should never be distracted by tangent conversations, okay? Like, why don't you eat pork? Or why do your women have to wear hijab and men don't? Or why is the penal code that you have? Or why and why and why, okay? Now, if we get caught up in those side conversations, will they ever end? No, right? The trick is to be able to sidestep those conversations and turn it around to talk about the core. So you'll say, that is a great question, excellent question, but for me to be able to explain it to you, we have to talk about the core or the main aspect, which is believing and worshiping only one God. Do you believe in a God? What did you just do? You just put them now on. You're starting to do da'wah, right? You move them away from the peripherals, because if they understand and believe in that central core, everything else will fall in place. Everything, right? Because they will submit. All these matters become more about of submission. Now, don't get me wrong. There's always wisdoms with these orders. There is wisdom. Every order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and every prohibition of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has wisdom from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We might not necessarily understand it or know it yet, and even if we know, we'll only know it partially, because we can never comprehend or encompass the entire wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so the trick is now to sideline and talk about the core issue. And then we engage in that da'wah, right? But it means that we also have to know the proofs of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all these things, so you can give that proper da'wah, right? And if he's talking to a Christian, what are how to indicate that what they're doing is actually not tawheed, that in fact that they actually are committing some sort of a polytheism at the core of it, or why that Isa ibn Maryam is not truly a deity, and so forth, right? That in reality that it's only one Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator, and so forth. You start a step in that and you focus on that, right? Now, if they're not willing to concede to that, then there's no point of discussing everything else. Because you started the conversation to understand this, let's talk about the core aspect, right? طيب. The fourth thing from this, verse, يا أبت لما تعبد ما لا يسمع ولا يبصر ولا يغني عنك شيئا. Ibrahim alayhi salam started talking about worship also, right? And once again, the core is we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what is worship over here, right? When we talk about worship, what is worship? Yes. What is your name? Aiden? What's your name, Sheikh? I hear Aiden. Aiden. Am I correct? Alhamdulillah. Because he kept repeating. I thought I got it wrong. I'm sorry. So what is worship, ya Aiden? I'm going to change that to submit to one person, right? We only submit to one person. That is actually true. That's perfect, right? Ibadah, right? Worship is submission. That's what it is. Worship is submission. And so this is how we understand that it is not just like, when we say it is salah, it is siyam, it is all these things, but the core of ibadah is submission, right? To submit. And the submission of the human being is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Now, can the human being submit to other than Allah? Can the human being submit to other than Allah? Type, let me rephrase this. Do human beings submit to other than Allah? Yes, right? And it comes in different forms, okay? Anytime we submit to something, right, as opposed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is our worship to them. This is why, for example, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, when He talks about وَاتَّخَذُوا أَحْبَارَهُمْ وَرُهْبَانَهُمْ أَرْبَابًا مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ, right? He talked about the people of the book. They took their ahbar, their scholars, وَرُهْبَانَهُم, and their worshippers, أَرْبَابًا, right? Lords or deity other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So they associate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, one of the people of the book that accepted Islam was with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he told him, "O Messenger of Allah, we did not worship them." And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Did they not make what is halal haram for you, and what is haram halal for you, and you obeyed them?" He said, "Yes." He said, "That is your worship to them, because you submitted to them in that change." So it tells you that worship comes in different forms, but it all has to do with submission. All right? And Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was telling his father, right? Talking about that submission. Like he's pointing out, why are you submitting to those idols? But he formed it in the form of a question. Why do you submit or worship what doesn't hear and doesn't see and doesn't benefit you? Because generally we're supposed to submit, right? Submit to the entity that does have the ability to benefit us. And part of the quality of that deity, for it to be able to benefit us, is that that entity has to have the ability of seeing and hearing. So when you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we know that He hears us. When we are in difficulty, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees us. When we do what is right or what is wrong, we know that Allah sees us. Okay? And so this is where Ibrahim alayhi salam, once again, it goes back to the whole cultural thing and aspect and understanding that they believed, right, that these deities benefit them. And so he asked him a question. He said, "My father, do they hear? Do they listen?" And if his answer is no, then how do they benefit you? Why are you submitting to them? Right? Now this is really important because it tells us that the human beings, and this is true in our religion, by the way, right? We have to reflect, right, on what we're submitting to, whatever it is. Because even though as Muslims, sometimes we submit to our desires, we have to think, why are we submitting to those desires? We have to reflect. But it also strengthens our conviction. It gives us the ability to realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala truly is the only entity deserving of worship. Nothing else. That we should not obey other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no matter what it is. If it's our spouses, our children, our family members, or whatever the case it is, okay, our own desires, there is no reason for us to submit to them, right? Especially when it contradicts the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We need to reflect on that. But it's also telling us that we also have to exercise our intellect and reflection, right? And it's calling people to exercise their intellect and reflect on what they're doing, who they're worshiping it, why they're worshiping it. Now, once again, it'll bring us more conviction in our faith, but it's also a way to do da'wah to others to make them reflect. it places that seed of doubt by making them think about what they're doing. Right? طيب. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam wanted to move his father's attention, right? To look at the attributes of what he's worshiping. Does it really deserve that worship? Okay. And so these are 4 things, right, in general, in that statement, in that first verse, right? So the first one is what? How he spoke to his father. He spoke it in the form of respect and mercy, right? The second is that he did not order him directly, do or don't, but rather he posed it in the form of a question. Third, he spoke at the core of the aspect, right? What is the most important thing? That's what he addressed. And then the fourth thing is that he talked about what are the attributes of the entity that we're supposed to submit to. Okay? Those are 4 things from that first verse. All right, now the second verse, it also starts with the Ya Abati. Once again, continuously reminding his father. And then he told me, إِنِّي قَدْ جَاءَنِي مِنَ الْعِلْمِ مَا لَمْ يَأْتِكَ فَاتَّبِعْنِي أَهْدِكَ صِرَاطًا سَوِيًّا. Right? There's a very interesting way of how he phrased this. So when Ibrahim alayhi salam said, إِنِّي قَدْ جَاءَنِي مِنَ الْعِلْمِ, right? There has come to me, or I've acquired, min al-ilm, from the knowledge. What does that tell you about, what does that say? Good. So Ibrahim as-salam is saying that, he's telling him, I have some knowledge. Is he telling him, I have knowledge you don't? Even though, by the way, we're talking about a prophet. The prophets were given immense amount of knowledge, right? This is why all the followers always lack in knowledge compared to the prophets, okay? But that's not how Ibrahim alayhi salam spoke to his father, right? He humbled himself, right? He brought it down. When he's speaking to his father and he's giving that advice, he did not describe himself as the prophet, the most knowledgeable on earth at this moment, and because of my knowledge, you are insignificant, you are an ignorant individual, you are not supposed to even reject what I'm saying, you are not in a position to reject what I'm saying. I'm telling you, this is what is right, then it must be right. This is how he spoke to him? No, right? Even though sometimes, by the way, we do that in our conversations with people, right? Unfortunately, sometimes we do that, right? Whether it's intentionally or not, sometimes we're kind of, and just for giving people the benefit of the doubt, sometimes people push them to do that by making them feel ignorant, and so they have to fall back and say, what are you talking about? I am the one who specializes in this, and I am the one who's that and that. And it pushes them sometimes to do that, right? And perhaps if it comes out in that way, there's an excuse, but to initiate it in the first place is not the correct thing to do, all right? And so, Ibrahim alayhi salam showed humble and humility, right, in his conversation with his father, right? And he said, I've been given some knowledge that you don't have. And so, قَدْ جَاءَنِي مِنَ الْعِلْمِ, right? Some knowledge, right? That you don't have. So this is, it's going to benefit you, right? This is going to be something that you did not know about. Hopefully, inshallah, it's beneficial for you, right? That is from, once again. And then he ended with, فَاتَّبِعْنِي, follow me, right? أَهْدِكَ صِرَاطًا سَوِيًّا. Follow me, not because I'm your son. So why should you follow me? Because of that knowledge, because it's the truth. So regardless whether I am your son or not, what you're following is the truth. What you're following is Allah. Okay? So he took himself essentially out of the equation, right? You're not following me because I'm your son, but you follow me because I brought the truth. I carry the truth. That's why you're going to follow, right? And then he said, أَهْدِكَ صِرَاطًا سَوِيًّا, right? I will guide you to the straight path. But before I go into that, this is really like an important message, and both for parents and children. Right, for parents and children. Whether we like it or not, we have to admit, as parents, we will never acquire complete knowledge and information of everything. And so quite often our children will have information we don't possess. Or they will highlight a fault that we have fell into, or that we have or possess, or an error that we have made. And they will come to us with that information that they have, or the error that we fell in. They may not come to us with the best way of presenting it, unfortunately, but it does not mean that we should reject that truth because we're the parents, right? The reality is that we should reflect on what is happening, and if it's correct, we should admit our error and follow it, right? In fact, what it will do is it will strengthen the relationship between the parent and the child. It will tell the child, right, that the truth is what is right is the most important thing, and you have to follow it regardless from who it comes from. Okay. That doesn't just, although we're talking about father and child relationship, but that holds true for any individual that holds a higher position versus a person who comes that is of a lower position. Whether you are the manager and you have people that you manage and they come to you, you accept the truth from them. If you've done an error or whatever the case is, you accept it. Whether it is, for example, a person who is the elder in a setting and a child comes to them, even if they're not related to them, regardless who it is, we accept it, right? Of course, we advise the person, the children or the child or the youth or whatever the case is, to present their argument in the most appropriate, well-mannered way, so that we have more of a chance of being accepted, right? This is a lesson we can learn from that, interaction between Ibrahim alayhi salam and his father, right? And so, as parents, we should not, yes, we are the parents, we know more, we have more experience, but in those occasions, sometimes our children will be right, right? Wallahu a'lam. Now, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he said, "Ihdika siratan sawiya." I will guide you to the straight path. So he's telling him, "Oh Father, the benefit is for you. Follow me, you will benefit. It is not for my benefit, right? It is your benefit." And to be honest, this is really important, because as Muslims, we should always want to benefit everyone else. We should always want to benefit. And we want to guide people for their benefit, not our benefit. Of course, alhamdulillah, we also do benefit from this, by the way. This is why one of the most rewardful thing is that a person be guided because of you, right? Even the Prophet ﷺ, he told Ali ibn Abi Talib that it is it is better for you that a single person be guided to Islam because of you. It's better for you, more beneficial than wealth, right? Humur al-Na'am is referring to one of the most expensive types of camels, and it is the albino camel, right? Albino camels, like what camels? They're very rare, they're very expensive. And if a person has a herd of that, they're considered rich. It's almost like having 100 Lamborghinis, for example, or Ferraris, whatever the case is, right? And so if you possess that amount, all that is not important and pales to the reward and what is better for you than of guiding an individual person to Islam, because you will get also the reward. Yes, we do benefit, but we're doing it because we want to benefit humanity, right? This is why we are also a mercy to the other nations. And so Ibrahim alayhi salam was telling him, I want to guide you to the straight path. You will benefit, right? So this has to do with the second verse. The third verse, Ibrahim alayhi salam said, "Ya abati la ta'budu ash-shaytana inna ash-shaytana kana lir-rahmani 'asiya." Oh my father, do not worship the shaitan, for he is towards the merciful disobedient. He was forever to the merciful disobedient, right? So, is Azar actually praying to the shaitan? Does he have a sculpture of the shaitan and bowing and worshiping the shaitan? So how is he worshiping the shaitan? Why did Ibrahim alayhi salam say to his father, don't worship the shaitan? That's true. Not worshiping Allah is you're worshiping the shaitan. Because remember, we're talking about submission over here, right? So the shaitan, essentially what he did is he adorned to the people worshipping other than Allah. And if we do that, then we submit it to the shaitan. If we're not worshipping Allah, then we are worshipping the shaitan. Now, this has to do with the reality, whether we like it or not. We were created as human beings to worship. It's just a matter of what we are going to worship. Are we going to worship Allah or anything else? Right? That's what it is. We are created this way. We will submit to something. We will dedicate our lives to something. That is our worship to it. Right? Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he has something interesting. He said, هربوا من الرق الذي خلقوا له فبلوا برق القلب والشيطان. They ran away from the servitude that they were created for, and so they were ibtulu, which means that they were, what's a good word for ibtulu over here? They were tested, right? They were tested, or they were afflicted, right, with the servitude, برق القلب, right, with the enslavement of the heart and the shaitan. The servitude of the heart and the shaitan, which means they serve themselves and the shaitan, right? And so this holds also true even to the atheist who claims that they don't worship anything. If you look at their behavior, they actually left the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the worship of their self, to the worship of their desire, or even to their group. That's not what they fell into, right? Because now their desire became what commands them and they obey everything. What became the most important thing for them is themselves, so they started worshiping themselves. Because you have to understand, once again, worship is submission. You're either going to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or anything else, right? And so they ran away from the worship of Allah to the worship of other human beings or desires or whatever the case is, right? So this is that third verse. The other one, يا أبت إني أخاف أن يمسك عذاب من الرحمن فتكون للشيطان وليا. Now, we definitely know that whomever worships idols and dies worshiping idols, what's going to happen to them? They will be punished in the hellfire for eternity. Now let's look at the wording. يا أبت إني أخاف. O my father, I fear أن يمسك عذاب من الرحمن, that you be touched by a punishment from the most merciful. Okay? Now this has like tons of things we need to unpack, right? What time is it? Do we have chai at the back again? I'm sorry, guys, I have to do this after prayers now, if you don't mind, right? I don't think we're going to have time to go into the response of Azar to Ibrahim alayhi salam, so we're going to leave it for next week, inshallah. But look at how he spoke to his father, right? He said, Inni akhaf, right? I fear. Now, when you fear something, does it indicate that there's imminence or that there's a possibility of escaping it? Possibility of escaping it, right? So essentially, he's not putting his father in a state of hopelessness, right? He's not telling him, you are in the hellfire. طيب? There's no hope for you, are destroyed. No, he didn't say that, right? He told him, right? He didn't give a definitive thing, but he told him, I fear for you that you be touched, right? By who? By the most merciful. He didn't tell him by the Jabbar, right? Shadidul Iqab. He's not, telling him that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Shadidul Iqab, the one who has the most severe of torments, right? Al-Jabbar. He didn't use these phrases, but he specifically said Ar-Rahman, to tell him that Allah is merciful, right? That there's always hope. That even though Allah will punish you, He is the most merciful. So come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And once again, if Azar definitely is going to stay in his disbelief, we know that definitely he will end up in the hellfire. And we know that from the other hadith that he is in the hellfire, right? Now, also, إني أخاف يمسك عذاب من الرحمن. The word عذاب over here is different than saying al-adhab, right? So, this is very, if you look at Arabic, this is it tells you a lot. Over here it's called nakira, right? Nakira, and there's mu'arraf. Nakira, which means it's not specified, right? Adab, as opposed to al-adab, right? Now this is also a way he's speaking to his father. Adab over here just means a type of punishment. A type of punishment. Now once again, it's how he's speaking to his father. He was doing that da'wah, right? And so if you look at these things, he did 4 things. He told him, I fear for you. He told him, like, Yamassaka, they will touch you. He said that he is talking about Ar-Rahman. And the last thing he said was a punishment. Now we can always change those 4, right? We can always say, I don't fear that this is what's going to happen, right? And not touch, but severe punishment. And not say the merciful, but say the most severe of punishment, Al-Jabbar. We could always say that. But Ibrahim a.s. was very selective of his words when he was talking to his father, to give him that hope, that form of, come follow the truth. This is what is better for you. Now, I think, well, actually, no, subhanAllah, I think I finished in time if I'm going to stop here. I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you want to talk about Azhar's response or give room for questions? Do you have any questions, actually? Chai, people want chai. طيب خلاص, all right. We will stop here, inshallah. We will look at the response of Azhar alayhi salam to his son, what kind of response he gave him, right? How he met the gentleness of Ibrahim alayhi salam in a different way. Now, what's also important I want to highlight, Ibrahim asked him questions. Did Azhar respond to those questions or not? And if he did, what did he respond? If he didn't, why didn't he respond? Those are all important things, inshallah, we can cover in the response of Azhar to Ibrahim's questions, right? Jazakumullah khair. Do you have any questions? No? Chai, let's go. Oh, okay, our question for one quick. It's never quick, Sheikh. So your brother in Sri Lanka, they have what? Yeah, and I can hear the question, so I can repeat it. So your brother in Sri Lanka, what happened? There's the footprint of Ibrahim alayhi salam where in Sri Lanka? That's interesting. There's the footprint of Ibrahim in Mecca. So what happened in Sri Lanka then? You Googled it, Sheikh Google. And what did Sheikh Google tell you this time? He said there's no proof, but people are mentioning? طيب. You don't see what's happening this side. He's being yelled at for delaying chai. طيب, do we have any questions? جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.